The music hall was buzzing with excitement and chatter as people found their seats. The air was thick with anticipation, the kind that made hearts beat a little faster and palms feel a little warmer. Rows of polished wooden chairs stretched across the room, all facing the grand piano at the center of the stage. The lights were dim, casting a soft glow over the audience, making the large room feel intimate despite its size. From the back, a few people whispered, glancing occasionally at the entrance, waiting for the next performer. They expected the usual, the confident, well-dressed students of prestigious music schools, the ones whose families had connections and reputations. Through the side door, she walked in quietly. She did not have the bright, stylish attire of the other performers, nor the air of self-assuredness that seemed to come naturally to them. Her clothes were simple, clean, and practical. She carried a small bag, not a designer case or a polished instrument, just her essentials. The crowd barely noticed her at first. Some people even turned to their companions with a soft chuckle, muttering things like, "She looks so ordinary," or "I don't think she stands a chance here." She heard nothing of it. In fact, she seemed completely unaware of the murmurs and sideways glances. Her focus was elsewhere, and that focus seemed to shield her from the judgments of strangers. She moved with careful steps toward the stage. Her posture was straight but relaxed, as if she belonged there without needing anyone's approval. She looked at the piano for a moment, her eyes tracing the smooth black and white keys, almost as if greeting an old friend. There was a calmness about her, quiet confidence that did not shout or demand attention, but radiated subtly, impossible to miss if someone looked closely. She set her bag aside gently and straightened her back, preparing herself for the moment that could change everything. The audience's attention shifted slowly toward her. Some leaned forward, curious, though skepticism lingered. They had been to countless performances, seen many young musicians attempt to dazzle the room, and most had fallen short. The whispers continued, soft but persistent. "She looks too young. She doesn't have the right stage presence. Maybe she should have started with smaller competitions." Yet in those whispers, no one noticed the quiet determination in her eyes, the calm steadiness of her hands. It was easy to underestimate her because she gave no hint of arrogance, no flashy gestures, no forced confidence. She took a deep breath, closing her eyes for just a second. In that moment, she felt the hours and hours of practice. The late nights alone in small rooms, her fingers dancing over keys while no one watched. She remembered the moments of frustration, when the notes refused to sound as she imagined, and the small triumphs when they finally obeyed her will. Every failure, every stumble, had led her to this moment. She had learned patience, resilience, and the quiet art of listening not just to the piano, but to herself. This was her strength, and though the audience could not see it, it was as real as the polished wood of the grand piano before her, as she positioned herself on the piano bench. A few people in the front rows raised their eyebrows. They had expected someone more glamorous, someone with a larger presence. But there she was, calm, modest, unassuming. The judges, sitting in their elevated seats, exchanged subtle glances. One of them, a stern man with a long history of judging piano competitions, leaned back slightly, a small smirk forming. This should be easy to judge, he thought. He assumed she would play a simple, perhaps even sloppy piece that would confirm his expectations. But he did not know that first impressions could be completely wrong. She adjusted her posture, her back straight, her shoulders relaxed. She rested her fingers lightly on the keys, not pressing, not making a sound. It was as if she was greeting the instrument, acknowledging its presence, and preparing to communicate through it. The audience noticed the quiet seriousness in her actions. Some started to sit a little straighter, curiosity piqued. The whispers slowly faded as the first wave of anticipation rolled through the room. Something about her calm presence was unusual. It was not flashy, but it was commanding in a subtle way. The room grew quieter. Even those who had been skeptical now leaned forward slightly, sensing that the moment to come might be more significant than they had imagined. The competition coordinator signaled that it was time to begin, but she remained in that quiet, focused state for just a few more seconds. She closed her eyes again briefly, letting the world outside fade away. There was no pressure, no need to impress. She was ready to share something much deeper than a performance. She was ready to tell a story through music. Then she opened her eyes and looked at the keys once more. Every note, every chord she had practiced countless times was waiting. Her fingers hovered above the keys, poised to release the sound that would surprise everyone. Some audience members shifted uneasily, unsure what to expect. They had assumed mediocrity, but there was something in the way she carried herself, in the calmness of her presence, that hinted at something entirely different. Still, the room was filled with doubt. It is human nature to underestimate what one does not understand at first glance. She was the perfect example of this. She did not speak, did not announce herself. She did not need to. Her music would speak for her. That was her way, always had been. Words were unnecessary. She could tell stories, evoke emotions, and capture attention entirely with the sound of her fingers on the piano. And though no one in the hall could see it yet, she was about to shatter every expectation they had formed in the first. A few seconds of her arrival, she began by gently pressing a key. The note resonated through the hall, soft but clear. There was an immediate shift in the energy of the room. Those who had been whispering moments before suddenly grew still. They listened intently, though they did not yet realize that the ordinary young woman they had underestimated was capable of extraordinary music. Her fingers moved with precision, but also with a delicate touch that made each note feel alive. The piano, an instrument that had once seemed so ordinary to the audience, now became an extension of her voice, an expression of her soul, even from the first note. It was evident that she was not just playing the piano. She was conversing with it. The subtle rise and fall of the melody hinted at emotion beyond technical skill. There was vulnerability, there was joy, there was longing, all expressed without a single word. The audience could feel it, though they might not have yet understood why. The room had shifted from skepticism to quiet intrigue. The smirk of the judge had softened into a look of careful attention. For the first time, he seemed to wonder if he had been wrong as she continued. The music began to grow more complex. Each hand moved with independence, yet they were perfectly synchronized, weaving harmony and melody together effortlessly. The simple, humble girl from the side entrance was creating a soundscape that seemed larger than the room itself. People leaned forward instinctively, drawn to the unexpected beauty that filled the space. Their earlier judgments, formed from appearances and assumptions, began to crumble silently. No one had predicted this level of talent, this depth of emotion. She did not rush. She did not show off. Each note was deliberate, meaningful. The audience began to feel the story she was telling through the piano. Some closed their eyes, letting the music wash over them. Others sat frozen, unsure whether to move or speak, captivated by what they were hearing. Even those who had doubted her most found themselves holding their breath, unable to look away from her hands as they danced over the keys. It was as if time itself had slowed down, and everyone in the hall was caught in a moment they would not forget. By the time the first piece reached its conclusion, a stunned silence hung in the air. The notes lingered, echoing softly, and for a moment no one dared to move or speak. The audience had been prepared for a performance that might be mediocre or forgettable. And instead, they had witnessed something remarkable. The young woman, quiet and unassuming, had already begun to rewrite their expectations. She had shown them that appearances could be deceiving, that true talent was often hidden where least expected. As she lifted her hands from the keys, she did not smile or bow excessively. She simply sat for a moment, breathing gently, as if she had only just begun. The audience remained silent, processing what they had just experienced. The whispering, the judgment, and the assumptions of the past few minutes seemed trivial now. They had underestimated her. Now the reality of her genius was slowly dawning on them. Even the judges, seasoned and experienced, felt a rare mix of awe and humility. They had seen many talented performers, but something about her presence, her control, and the emotional depth of her playing was unusual. It was not just skill. It was a combination of technique, feeling, and something intangible that made her performance unforgettable. They realized that in their moment of underestimation, they had missed the most important aspect of Hertha's ability to connect deeply with anyone who would listen. She sat quietly, almost blending into the piano bench, yet her presence was powerful. The hall seemed to pulse with the energy she had released through her music. People whispered softly to each other now, not with doubt, but with wonder. Some shook their heads, still unable to fully comprehend what they had just heard. Others smiled, moved by the beauty and honesty of her playing, and through it all, she remained calm, grounded, and humble, her eyes reflecting a quiet satisfaction that came not from applause, but from expressing herself fully and truthfully that evening. The audience learned a lesson they would not forget. Talent is not always obvious at first glance. Appearances can be misleading, and sometimes the most extraordinary gifts are hidden behind the simplest exterior. She had arrived quietly, underestimated by all, and yet, in those first moments at the piano, she had begun to reveal a genius that would leave a lasting, caged impression on everyone present. The first part of her story had ended, but it was only the beginning. The music hall had witnessed a quiet arrival, a subtle shift in energy, and a hint of brilliance that promised far more than anyone had imagined. She had captured their attention not with words, not with flashy gestures, but with the pure, undeniable power of her music. And in that moment, the audience knew that they had underestimated her at their peril. The room remained silent after her first notes had faded. But the quiet was not the empty kind of silence. It was full of attention, full of anticipation. Everyone was holding their breath, waiting to see what she would do next. The audience, who had just assumed she was a beginner, was beginning to feel a strange mix of curiosity and disbelief. She hadn't played anything extravagant yet, but there was something in the way her fingers touched the keys that made them all lean forward, as if drawn by a magnetic force they could not name. She rested her hands lightly on her lap for a brief second, closing her eyes again, as if she were listening to something that no one else could hear. The hall seemed to shrink around her. The chatter, the movements, even the nervous shifting in seats, all faded into the background. She was not playing yet, but already her presence was commanding attention. The audience began to sense that this was more than a simple performance. There was focus, a quiet power, and a sense of purpose in the way she held herself. The judge, who had smirked at her arrival, leaned forward slightly. His interest piqued. He had been expecting a simple, possibly clumsy performance. Instead, he saw a young woman sitting quietly, preparing in her own rhythm, as if she were speaking to the piano rather than performing for them. Something about the calm in her movements told him that this was not a performance born of showmanship. It was sincerity. And sincerity, he realized slowly, could be far more powerful than any flashy gesture or dramatic entrance. Then, without a word, she moved her hands toward the keys. The first note she struck this time was deliberate, full, and deep. It filled the hall in a way that made people sit up straighter. She was no longer testing the waters, she was beginning her story. And it was not a story that could be easily ignored. Every note seemed to have meaning, as if each one carried a small piece of her life, a memory or an emotion. The music was layered and subtle, weaving a pattern that was intricate without being overwhelming. Some in the audience exchanged glances, sure of what they were witnessing. They had expected simplicity, perhaps a touch of clumsiness. And now they were hearing complexity that went far beyond their expectations. They began to feel a quiet thrill, that sensation when you realize something extraordinary is happening right before your eyes. Even those who were polite skeptics, who had initially dismissed her, could not help but be pulled in by the music. Her hands moved across the keys with a grace that seemed effortless. One could see the years of practice, the countless late nights, the discipline that had built her skill. But what made the performance unique was not only the technical mastery, it was the emotion. Each note was infused with feeling. There were subtle rises and falls, small hesitations that made the music human, alive, and relatable. It was as though she was speaking directly to the hearts of everyone listening, telling them a story without a single word. A few children in the audience were captivated in a way that surprised their parents. Their eyes widened, and they sat completely still, watching the young woman's hands dance across the keys. One child whispered to a parent, "How is she doing that?" The parent smiled, equally mesmerized, unable to explain the feeling that was filling the room. It was not just skill. It was something more, something rare and impossible to teach. As she continued, her fingers shifted with precision and speed. moving through complex patterns that would have seemed impossible for someone so young and seemingly ordinary. There was a fluidity in her movement that made the complicated passages look effortless. She played with intention, letting every note resonate fully before moving on to the next. She did not rush. She did not show off. She simply played. And the music carried the audience along like a gentle current, pulling them forward. The hall itself seemed to respond. The chandeliers above reflected the movement of her hands in soft glimmers. The polished floor echoed faintly with each note, enhancing the sound and making it seem even larger than it was. The walls, lined with ornate panels, absorbed the music and reflected it back with subtle warmth. Every detail of the room seemed to contribute to the atmosphere she was creating, yet she remained the central focus. All eyes were on her. All ears were attuned to her. The judge who had doubted her at first could not look away. He had seen countless performers in his life, but few had struck him in this way. There was depth in her playing that demanded attention. Not once did she look for approval, not once did she hesitate for recognition. Her confidence was quiet, almost invisible, yet undeniable. It was the kind of confidence that comes from knowing yourself completely and trusting the work you have. It's put in for years. She transitioned to a new piece, one that required a different style and a subtle change in emotion. The shift was smooth, seamless. The audience noticed the contrast immediately. The first part had been calm and introspective. The new section was more lively, filled with energy and a sense of joy. She could move from softness to strength in a heartbeat, taking the audience on an emotional journey without any verbal guidance. Every person in the hall was swept along, experiencing the music in their own way, yet all connected by the thread of her performance. A few people in the audience began to wipe tears from their eyes. The music was not sad, not tragic, but it was beautiful in a way that touched something deep inside. It spoke of dreams, of struggle, of moments of triumph that might otherwise go unnoticed. There was honesty in every chord, honesty that resonated with anyone willing to listen. And in that honesty, the audience found themselves reflecting on their own lives, their own challenges, their own unspoken hopes. Some of the performers waiting backstage had begun to peek out from behind the curtains. They had heard her playing, and they too were captivated. Some had thought that the competition was theirs for the taking, that they were the stars of the evening. Yet now, watching her, they realized they had misjudged the quiet young woman who had entered the hall so unassumingly. Her talent was undeniable. It carried a presence far greater than any display of showmanship they could manage. The more she played, the more the audience leaned in. No one wanted to miss a single note. Even those who had been skeptical, who had quietly prepared to dismiss her performance, now found themselves completely absorbed. They could feel the subtle changes in tempo, the emotional highs and lows, and the nuanced layers of sound. It was as if she was painting pictures with her music, each note a brushstroke, each chord a color. The room itself seemed to transform, filled with a living, breathing work of art that could not be contained by the walls. She moved with rhythm and intuition, almost as if the piano itself were an extension of her body. The way she connected with the instrument made it seem alive. It responded to her touch, her intentions, and her emotions. Every note was deliberate, yet natural. Every pause meaningful. There was no wasted movement, no unnecessary flourish. She did not perform for applause. She performed for the music itself. And in doing so, she brought the audience into a state of shared wonder. The hall was silent except for the piano. But it was a silence full of life. Every person listening was holding their breath at some points, letting go at others, caught in the ebb and flow of her performance. The energy in the room shifted constantly, moving with the music. Those who had doubted her were now fully engaged, their skepticism replaced with admiration. They had come expecting something ordinary, but they were receiving something extraordinary. And the realization that they had underestimated her was almost tangible, a quiet shock running through the crowd. She paused briefly, letting the final note of a phrase linger. The sound seemed to float in the air, held by the anticipation of the audience. Everyone waited, unsure if the next note would match the beauty of the first. And then she continued, moving into a section of the piece that was even more complex, demanding greater skill and focus. Her fingers flew over the keys with both precision and grace. The notes were clear, vibrant, and emotionally charged. Each chord told a story, and each melody conveyed a feeling. It was music that spoke directly to the heart. Bypassing logic and appealing to pure emotion, the judge could no longer maintain a detached demeanor. He leaned forward, watching intently, realizing that his initial assumption had been completely wrong. This was not a simple, ordinary performance. This was a display of talent, depth, and artistry that few people ever had the privilege to witness. His pen hovered over his score sheet, but he did not write. He simply watched, taking in every movement, every note, every subtle gesture that made the performance extraordinary. By now, the audience was fully captivated. Some held their hands together, as if in prayer, overwhelmed by the beauty and sincerity of the music. Others sat motionless, their eyes fixed on her hands, unable to look away. She had drawn them in completely, not with drama, not with flash, but with something far more powerful: authentic talent and genuine expression. Each note was a word in a story that everyone could understand, a story that transcended age, background, and expectation. When the piece finally reached its softer conclusion, the audience remained still for a moment, caught in the lingering resonance of the music. No one spoke. There was no applause yet. The impact of what they had just heard was too deep for immediate reaction. They were still processing the realization that the young woman they had underestimated could create something so moving, so profound, and so undeniably masterful. Her hands lifted slowly from the keys, resting lightly on her lap once again. She did not rush to bow, did not seek recognition. Her expression was calm, almost serene. She had communicated something far more important than technique or appearance. She had connected with the hearts of everyone in the room, and that connection was deeper than any applause could convey. The room felt charged, alive, and changed. Even though no one could quite explain why, she took a deep breath and looked up, meeting the eyes of a few audience members. There was no arrogance in her gaze, no demand for approval, just a quiet acknowledgement, as if to say, "Thank you for listening." And in that simple gesture, she won something far greater than admiration. She earned respect, not through words, but through the undeniable power of her music. The music hall seemed to hold its breath as she prepared for the next piece. The silence was no longer tense. It was filled with curiosity, anticipation, and awe. The audience had been captivated already, but now something deeper was stirring. They realized they had underestimated her. What they had first dismissed as an ordinary performance had turned into an extraordinary display of talent and emotion. Now, as she poised her fingers above the keys once more, a sense of wonder hung in the air, palpable and electric. She leaned slightly forward, eyes briefly scanning the piano keys, as if greeting them again. Then, she let her fingers settle, light and precise, on the ivory. The first note resonated softly, a delicate whisper that immediately drew the audience closer, both physically and emotionally. Her music did not shout for attention. It invited it, and slowly it began to grow, layer upon layer, building a story without words, a story that each person in the room felt in their own way. The young woman's hands moved with incredible precision and fluidity. Every note was deliberate, yet it seemed effortless. The transitions between chords were seamless, almost invisible, as if the piano itself were an extension of her being. Some audience members leaned forward instinctively, their eyes fixed on her hands, trying to understand how such grace and skill could come from someone so modest in appearance. They watched as her fingers danced, weaving melodies and harmonies that were rich, complex, and full of life. A subtle smile appeared on her face, not because she sought admiration, but because she was immersed in the music. She was not performing for the audience. She was sharing a part of herself with them. Every rise and fall of the melody, every gentle pause and sudden accent, conveyed her feelings. The music was alive, and in its living beauty, the audience felt emotions they could not name. Some felt joy, some felt nostalgia, some felt a bittersweet longing. But all were united in awe, drawn in by the artistry unfolding before them in the front row. The judge who had doubted her from the beginning was now fully engaged. His earlier smirk had vanished, replaced by a look of astonishment and respect. He had seen countless performers in his life, but this young woman's mastery was rare. It was not only technical skill, it was something deeper, something that could not be taught. The connection she created between herself, the piano, and the audience was magical. He realized that his initial assumption had been completely wrong. She was no ordinary player. She was an artist in her purest form. The music began to grow in intensity. Her fingers moved faster now, but there was no sense of rushing. Each note was clear and resonant, every chord perfectly articulated. She shifted effortlessly between delicate whispering melodies and powerful dramatic phrases that filled the hall with sound. The audience was caught in the ebb and flow of her performance, carried along by the tide of her music. Some closed their eyes, letting the sound wash over them, feeling it in their chest and heart rather than just in their ears. A few young musicians waiting backstage had pressed their faces against the curtain, watching her in silence. They had come expecting a competition, expecting to see their own skills shine. Instead, they saw someone who had transformed the room with her talent, played with a confidence and maturity far beyond her years. Some felt nervous, others inspired, but all were captivated. They had underestimated her, just as the audience had, and now they were witnessing the proof of her extraordinary abilities. The piece shifted again, moving into a section that demanded even greater control and expression. Her hands seemed to fly over the keys, performing intricate runs and arpeggios with stunning clarity. The audience could hardly follow the speed of her fingers, yet every note was precise, every phrase perfectly balanced. It was a performance that combined skill, emotion, and intuition in a way that made the complex seem simple, the difficult appear effortless. There was a subtle power in her music that grew with every passing moment. The hall was no longer just a room. It had become a vessel for her expression. Every person present felt the weight and beauty of what she was creating. Some felt chills run down their spines. Some felt tears forming in their eyes. But all were captivated by the honesty and depth of her playing. Her music was more than sound. It was storytelling, a journey into the soul. As she continued, she began to incorporate subtle dynamics, soft and loud, slow and fast, weaving them seamlessly into the fabric of the piece. The music had a rhythm of its own, a heartbeat that resonated with everyone listening. Each crescendo felt like a wave, each gentle passage like a whisper shared with the audience personally. The performance was immersive, and the listeners were completely absorbed. They could not look away, could not even blink without feeling that they might miss something essential. She played with an emotional clarity that was rare even among the most seasoned performers. Every phrase carried meaning. Every note spoke of experience, patience, and a deep understanding of music as a language. She was not showing off, but teaching through her playing. The room seemed to lean toward her, drawn in by the invisible thread of her talent and passion. It was impossible to doubt her now. Anyone who had thought of her as ordinary was forced to confront the truth. She was remarkable. The audience could feel her emotions as if they were their own. There were moments of quiet reflection, almost like whispers to the soul, followed by bursts of intensity that stirred excitement and wonder. Each transition was smooth, yet full of expression, as if she were conversing with the listeners directly through the piano. It was not just a performance. It was a dialogue, a shared experience, and a revelation all at once. Some people began to whisper, though softly, too afraid to break the spell. "She's incredible," one person said, almost breathlessly. Another shook their head in disbelief. "How can someone be this talented?" The judge, too, was muttering under his breath, taking notes with one hand, but watching her with full attention. There was admiration, astonishment, and a growing sense of humility in the room. Everyone realized that they had underestimated her, that their earlier assumptions had been completely misguided. Her playing shifted yet again, moving into a section that demanded not only technical skill, but deep emotional resonance. She slowed slightly, letting each note breathe, allowing the music to linger in the air. The sound filled every corner of the hall, reaching even those seated at the very back. It was intimate, yet powerful, personal yet universal. The audience could feel the care and thought in every decision she made, the patience, the dedication, and the artistry. Even the people who had been most skeptical were now leaning forward, completely captivated. Their eyes followed every movement of her hands, trying to understand how such beauty could emerge from someone so young and unassuming. They could not help but feel humbled by the realization that talent and genius do not announce themselves with loud gestures or flashy appearances. Sometimes, brilliance comes quietly, unassuming, and yet utterly undeniable. As the piece approached its climax, her music became more complex and layered. The melodies intertwined, the harmonies soared, and the rhythm carried a sense of unstoppable momentum. The audience was swept along by the wave of sound, unable to resist the pull of her artistry. Some felt tears welling in their eyes, moved by the sheer emotion and skill of the performance. Others felt a surge of inspiration, a desire to pursue their own passions with the same dedication they were witnessing. She did not rush the climax, nor did she force it. Each note arrived naturally, each chord resolved perfectly. It was as if she were shaping the music from within, letting it emerge fully formed rather than imposing it on the piano. There was a purity to her approach, a clarity that made the complex passages seem effortless. The audience felt the power and grace of her performance, and they were silent, not out of fear or boredom, out of awe and respect. By now, the hall was completely absorbed in her music. The energy was tangible, almost as if the room itself were alive, responding to her playing. The audience had been drawn into a world where only the piano and her talent mattered. All doubts, all judgments, all underestimations had been erased. She had revealed the depth of her genius, and it was impossible to ignore. Every listener knew they were witnessing something rare and precious, a performance that would be remembered long after the final note faded. The judge leaned forward, eyes wide, unable to contain his amazement. He had seen countless musicians in his lifetime, but rarely had anyone left such an impression. He realized that his assumptions had been wrong, that his initial judgment had been shallow. This young woman, quiet and unassuming, had proven herself in a way that could not be denied. Her talent was real, profound, and unforgettable. As the final section of the piece approached, she slowed again, letting the music soften, drawing the audience in for one last intimate moment. The notes lingered in the air, echoing softly, wrapping around the listeners like a gentle embrace. The room was completely still, yet it felt alive with the energy she had created. The audience was not merely listening, they were feeling, experiencing, and connecting. She had taken them on a journey, one that began with quiet doubt and ended with astonishment and awe. When the last note finally faded, there was a pause. The audience did not move immediately. They remained seated, letting the silence absorb what they had just experienced. It was a silence full of emotion, full of respect, full of awe. They had underestimated her at first, but now they understood. She was not just a pianist. She was a storyteller, an artist, and a genius who had revealed herself instantly, leaving everyone changed by what they had witnessed. The moment she began the next piece, the atmosphere in the hall changed completely. What had been awe and curiosity transformed into full attention and admiration. Every person present felt as though they had been transported into another world, a world where the piano spoke the truth and the young woman sitting at it was the messenger. She did not rush, did not seek to dazzle with speed or technical showmanship. Instead, she allowed the music to grow organically, each note carefully chosen, its pause deliberate. Her fingers glided over the keys with an elegance that seemed almost unreal. Every movement was precise, yet there was no stiffness, no sense of effort. It was as if she had become one with the piano, an extension of herself. The sound filled the room, flowing into every corner, and yet it carried a personal intimacy that made each listener feel as though the music was speaking directly to them. There was no question in anyone's mind, now she was a true artist, a musician whose talent went far beyond technical skill. The audience leaned in, caught in the spell of her performance. Some could feel their hearts racing, their breaths slowing to match the rhythm of the music. There was something almost magical in the way she played, a connection that transcended words and explanations. The notes were not just sounds. They were expressions of emotion, experiences, and stories that she shared with the room. Each chord struck a chord within the listeners themselves, touching parts of them they had not known were waiting to be reached. The judge, who had been skeptical at first, now sat completely captivated. His pen lay forgotten on the desk in front of him as he watched her hands move over the keys. He had seen talented performers before, but few had ever left such an impression. There was depth in her playing, a richness of emotion, an understanding that few could match. Every pause, every flourish, every gentle release of a note felt intentional, meaningful, and alive. It was not merely music. It was communication, storytelling, and connection, all at once. Some audience members felt tears prick their eyes. The piece was beautiful, yes, but it was more than that. It was honest. It conveyed joy, sorrow, hope, and longing, all intertwined. People remembered moments from their own lives, emotions long buried, hopes that had been quieted. The music seemed to reach into the very core of the listeners' hearts, awakening something profound. And yet, she played with quiet humility. There was no attempt to show off, no demand for recognition, only the pure expression of her talent and her feelings. The complexity of her performance grew with each passing moment. She moved seamlessly between passages that required speed, precision, and technical mastery to those that demanded a delicate touch and subtle emotional control. Her hands were a blur at times, yet each note landed perfectly, clear and resonant. The audience could hardly believe what they were hearing. They had underestimated her. Now they were witnessing a level of genius that left them in awe. It was not only the speed or the technicality that impressed them. It was the emotion that flowed through every phrase. The music rose and fell like the tide, gentle and forceful in turns, carrying the listeners along in a journey they could not have predicted. Some felt their pulse quicken, their emotions swell, while others felt a deep calm settle within them. Soothed by the beauty and sincerity of the performance, everyone felt it, each in their own way, yet all connected by the spell she had cast. The young woman's eyes were focused but calm. She was aware of the audience, yet she was not distracted by it. Her attention was on the piano, on the music, and on the story she was telling. She let the sound flow naturally, allowing each note to breathe, each phrase to settle before moving forward. The audience could sense the care and thought in every movement. This was not a hurried display or a rehearsed trick. It was a true performance, alive with intention, skill, and soul. As she moved into the middle section of the piece, the music took on a more intense and dramatic quality. Her hands flew over the keys, the notes cascading in complex patterns that seemed almost impossible. Yet even in the most intricate passages, the sound was clear, pure, and emotionally charged. The audience was mesmerized. Some could hardly follow the speed of her fingers, yet they felt every emotion she expressed, every subtle nuance in the melody. It was as if the music itself was speaking directly to them, bypassing all logic and speaking only to the heart. A few people in the audience pressed their hands to their mouths, unable to contain their amazement. They had come expecting a simple, ordinary performance, perhaps a pleasant interlude in a long evening. Instead, they were witnessing brilliance, a talent that demanded recognition and respect. They felt honored to be present, to be able to hear and feel what she was creating. Even those who had doubted her, who had whispered dismissive comments moments before, were now leaning forward, completely absorbed and humbled. The judge, too, felt a rare sense of awe. He had judged thousands of performances, yet few had left him as speechless as this one. He realized that he had misjudged her entirely, that he had underestimated not only her skill, but also her ability to connect, to move, and to inspire. He began to jot down notes not just about her technical execution, but about the emotional power and presence she brought to the piano. This was not just a performance. It was a revelation. Her music moved seamlessly between gentle, reflective passages and powerful, dramatic surges. The audience felt the contrasts keenly, swept along by the ebb and flow of her artistry. She allowed the softer sections to linger, each note a whisper that seemed to speak directly to the listener's soul. Then, without warning, the music would surge, vibrant and full, filling the hall with a wave of sound that left the audience breathless. It was a masterful balance of subtlety and grandeur, precision and feeling, skill and soul. Some of the young musicians waiting backstage had begun to peek through the curtains, their eyes wide with disbelief. They had seen many talented performers, but few had demonstrated such a combination of technical skill, emotional depth, and natural expression. They realized that they had underestimated her as well, that she was not simply another competitor, but a true artist capable of transforming a room with her music. Inspiration mixed with humility as they silently vowed to learn from what they had witnessed. Her performance began to build toward a climax, a section that demanded the full range of her abilities. Her hands moved rapidly, effortlessly, weaving complex harmonies while maintaining perfect clarity. Every chord was resonant, every melody precise, yet each note was imbued with feeling. The audience felt themselves swept along in the wave of sound, completely absorbed. Some felt tears forming in their eyes, others felt chills run down their spine, and all felt the undeniable truth of her genius. The young woman did not show any sign of strain or fatigue. She remained composed, her focus absolute. Her breathing was steady, her movements fluid, as if the piano itself were an extension of her being. She allowed the music to breathe, to expand, and to reach every corner of the hall. The audience was held in rapt attention, sensing the power and beauty of every moment. They were witnessing not just skill, but mastery, the rare kind that combines technique, emotion, and authenticity in perfect harmony. The final section of the piece approached, and with it, the full expression of her talent became evident. She played with a balance of power and delicacy, precision and emotion. The notes seemed to resonate not just in the hall, but within the hearts of everyone listening. The audience felt each chord, each phrase, each subtle pause. They felt the care, the attention, and the soul she poured into the performance. It was impossible to doubt her ability, impossible to ignore the brilliance that radiated from her every movement. Even the skeptics were captivated now. Their earlier doubts completely dissolved. They realized that appearances could be deceiving, that quiet, unassuming talent could be far more powerful than any outward display. They had underestimated her, and now they were humbled by the truth of her abilities. Some whispered to their neighbors words of awe and admiration barely audible. Afraid to break the spell that had taken hold of the room, she slowed the tempo slightly, letting each note linger, allowing the audience to fully absorb the depth of her music. The softer passages carried intimacy, drawing listeners into a shared private space within the public hall. Then, gently, she allowed the intensity to rise once more, not for drama, but to complete the narrative she had created. Every crescendo, every delicate touch was deliberate and meaningful. It was a testament to her skill, her emotion, and her understanding of the power of music. When the final note rang out, it lingered in the air, soft and resonant, echoing in the minds and hearts of all present. The audience remained still, caught in the quiet afterglow of her performance. No one rushed to applaud. The silence was not empty. It was full of awe, respect, and reflection. They had underestimated her at the start, but now they understood. They had witnessed something extraordinary, a performance that transcended expectation, talent, and artistry. For a moment, the young woman simply sat at the piano, her hands resting lightly on the keys, her breathing calm. She did not bow or seek acknowledgement. Her expression was serene, as if she had shared exactly what she intended to share. The audience, still in stunned silence, slowly began to clap, softly at first, then louder, till the hall was filled with the sound of admiration and appreciation. The applause was genuine, heartfelt, and well-deserved, but it did not define the impact of her performance. The true measure was in the awe, the inspiration, and the deep emotional connection she had created.